Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a new week of broadcasting here at the Virtual Center. Today is Monday. Today is the 21st day of November, the Monday of Thanksgiving week, if you can believe that, as we move towards the end of the 11th month of the year 2016. And it's hard to believe that we're just a little bit over a month before Christmas. Absolutely hard to believe. Welcome to the Virtual Center for the study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this Monday. It is a beautiful Monday. It is clearly a winter Monday. We're here in this area, we're cold, but we are clear and we are sunny, and overhead and looking out the window, it is just absolutely a gorgeous day. I was looking on Facebook this morning. A friend of mine in upper New York State is buried in snow. They are buried in lake effect snow in the Syracuse area, up in that area of northern New York, and absolutely beautiful photographs of the area that he lives in, but the snow is deep and it's still coming down, as he said. So we don't have any of that. We had kind of a rough weekend in terms of rain turning to snow and high winds and those kinds of things, but all of that has passed now. It left the cold weather with us, but the sun is shining, the sky is blue, and it is a Monday, and we are here, and everything is fine. It is a pleasure to be with you here at the beginning of a new week. I do encourage you to share your ideas and your thoughts with us here at the Virtual Center, not just for my benefit, but for the benefit of our other listeners as well. I spent quite a bit of time this morning in thinking about today's program, recalling our final hour in Wednesday's program, the last time that we were together here live, when Horst called, and we chatted for about the last 40 minutes of the program on Wednesday, if you'll recall. And it was just I thought it was just one of the best segments that we've had here at the Virtual Center in a long time. That always happens, it seems, when we get our listeners to call. So I encourage you to do it. Again, we do encourage this and brand this program as an interactive program, and part of the reason we do that is because the real educational power of the internet, it lies clearly in the interactions and the between people that it makes possible. And again, we've had the ability to transmit information in one direction to another, in only one direction, for a long time. When that came about, when television, after radio, when television first emerged, everybody thought that it was going to revolutionize education. And it didn't. And I believe part of the reason is because the transmission of information is not, despite assumptions to the contrary, is not learning, is not education. Education is the process of change that happens within people upon engaging new information, new ideas, new principles, different thinking, if you will. It's not the new ideas or the thinking that is the education. The education is the change that occurs within you. But the interaction has to happen first. And I believe that that's really the educational potential of the internet. I think we're beginning to gradually see that and recognize it. It really is the key to improving understanding and education. That's one of the reasons that I push it so frequently, so hard here at the Virtual Center, because I really believe it. And I think we saw it last week, and I do appreciate Horst and the insight that he brings to the program when he joins us. And I don't want anybody anybody else to feel, intimidated or anything by that. The fact of the matter is, when there is that kind of interaction, it seems that all of us benefit, all of us learn from it. I learn from it, you learn from it, we all do. So again, I do encourage you to, if you are so inclined, to feel comfortable to pick up the phone and join us here on the air. The number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. If you're a little bit uncomfortable doing that, but at the same time you do have things you'd like to share, then I really urge you to drop me an email and let me know your thoughts and your ideas. I'll do the best I can to acknowledge receipt of your email, and if it seems appropriate, I'll try to get your ideas on the air in your place. I will do the very best I can to represent you, your ideas, your thoughts. I'm not looking to change or reinterpret anything. I just believe that if you take the time to put together an email on a particular topic, the least I can do is make sure that I do everything I can to represent your interests and your thoughts in an honest, balanced, fair way. That's the best that I can do, and I commit to you that I'll do everything I can to do that. My email address is waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. And finally, I do encourage you to check every once in a while our Facebook page. If you are a regular user of Facebook, you know that if you go to the homepage, facebook.com, you'll see at the top of the page a search box. And if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page. And on that page, I continually try to post items and issues of interest and concern, articles that I've read that I thought you might appreciate as a listener of the Virtual Center. I try to do everything I can when I do post a link like that to an article or to a piece that I've seen somewhere. I try to put something of myself on that posting along with the resource, along with the source or the article in question. Because I really feel that I do owe you, the listener, the respect to say to you, here's something I think you might be interested in, and here's why. Here's what I think this particular piece tells us or gives us that we may not have had before. Obviously, if you don't agree or accept it or agree with it, that's fine. There's plenty of places there for you to make comment to that effect. Either on Facebook itself, by dropping me an email, by calling our phone-in line, whatever. But the purpose of the Facebook page is to cover or share with you some of the things that sometimes we don't get the time to address here at the Virtual Center, because we're not on but 6 hours, 5.5 hours a week. But at the same time, there are issues and ideas and thoughts that I think all of us might benefit from. I've been doing that this weekend. There were 3 or 4 different times that I took to the Facebook page in order to post a link to a particular article. I've done it over the last 3 or 4 days, 3 or 4 times, as I mentioned. And then yesterday, I put something that was not a link to anybody else's article. It was my own. I just felt the need to say something after trying to accommodate within myself some of the issues and events associated with the transition, the Trump team's transition to power, as it were, and some of the things that were going on. And I became very, very concerned. Like everybody else, I watch the news. I pay attention to what's going on. And like many people, I'm very, very concerned and very disturbed about some of the things that are happening during this transition period. I had hoped, I tend to be an optimist, as I've said, and I think people who regularly follow the program know that. But I hoped throughout, after the election, that we would begin to see an effort to try to relieve or alleviate some of the concerns that people out there have about a pending Trump administration. I really believe that the ball was in Mr. Trump's court. I believe that he had the opportunity. First of all, he's got the opportunity to do some things that I don't believe Barack Obama ever had. I don't believe Barack Obama never had the opportunities that Trump has. Part of the reason is because of the nature of Congress, in terms of who controls Congress. But even beyond that, it seems to me, Donald Trump was able to conduct his campaign through the primaries and through the final campaign itself against Hillary Clinton in a way which did not wed him to the leadership of the Republican Party. He pretty much ran as a lone wolf, so to speak. And he created a situation where the leaders of the party finally were forced to come to him. He didn't have to go to them in order to pull the party together. His basic argument is, I'm here, I'm winning, I have a tremendous amount of support among the people of this nation, and ultimately I keep winning, and you all have no choice but to come to me on my terms. And the Paul Ryans and McConnells and the others have done that. So consequently, as the new administration takes shape during this transition period, it seems to me that Donald Trump has opportunities that no incoming president that I can think of for a long time has had. I think in terms of the mandate for change that Barack Obama had when he was elected, especially the first time in 2008, I think the time was right there for the kind of change in Washington and in government that the nation was prepared for. But as we know, the Republican Party leadership pretty much made the decision to block Obama change from the very beginning. McConnell said it, others agreed with it, and throughout the 8 years of the Obama administration, for the most part, the Republican leadership has done just that. Now it's their turn. The only difference is they didn't control the shots of the incoming president on their side. That president, in effect, forced them to come to him. So again, I think he has the same kind of environment, the same kind of opportunities that Obama had psychologically and politically. But at the same time, he's got the political mechanisms within Washington to make it happen. These folks really don't have much of an option except to go along with what he wants to do. My feeling is then, during this transition period, that he would begin to do things and articulate positions on issues which would alleviate and relieve a lot of the anxiety that exists throughout the country about a Trump presidency. He hasn't done that. In fact, to a large degree, he's done quite the opposite. With some of the very few real appointments that he's made so far, he's pretty much thrown gasoline on the fire, so to speak. If he's done anything, he's increased the degree of anxiety that exists in the country. We see it. We see evidences of violence and bullying and racism and bigotry and all the rest of it throughout the country. I've heard reports literally that that if you did the research, you'd find that there are literally thousands of cases that seem to be happening. The situation is ripe for a move on Mr. Trump's part. So far, he's not made that move. And it concerns me as much as it concerns a lot of other people as well. I've been dealing in recent days with a lot of people who refuse to accept the realities of a Trump administration. There are a lot of people, I think President Obama is probably the most obvious example of this. A lot of people who believe and who have argued that we owe this man a chance. There's no reason, it is unfair to basically label him all of these negative terms when in fact he hasn't even been sworn into office yet. Rather, what we really need to do is to give him a chance and be willing to do everything we can do to allow him to be successful in the areas where we believe and we're convinced he ought to be successful. But there are certain areas that we ought not to be. I saw a headline this morning about Chuck Schumer, recently elected head of the minority, the Democratic minority in the Senate, to replace Harry Reid. And Chuck Schumer made the comment that, quote, we're willing to compromise, but not on the Affordable Care Act. And so basically what Schumer is saying is we will do everything we can do to block efforts to totally destroy the Affordable Care Act and take 20 million of people away from health care that they have only had for a short period of time. And even Donald Trump, in his infamous interview with Leslie Stahl a week ago Sunday, made the point that there are certain elements within the Affordable Care Act that he feels are very strong, and he plans to keep them. He plans, if he does make changes, to transition so that these people will not go even one day without health care. So on one hand, he seems to be willing to move towards the center and make efforts to bring everybody together. He continually talks about bringing everybody together. But the appointments of Bannon and Flynn and some of these other people kind of say to a lot of us just the opposite. So I think, like many of you, I've been really concerned. Yesterday, I took to Facebook in the morning and I posted just a short piece. It's not very long, but it's based on a couple of things that occurred over the weekend that made me feel quite concerned. I wanted to share that with you if you haven't checked our Facebook page, because very honestly, I've gotten a lot of response on Facebook to it. This is not, frequently when you put things on Facebook, you get a lot of likes and shares and that kind of stuff. People like it enough to share it with somebody else, or they just click and say that they liked it or they agreed with it or whatever, which really doesn't tell you a whole lot. I appreciate it. I think everybody does. But at the same time, it doesn't give you a lot of input. But this piece, I was quite surprised, elicited a number of substantive comments in response to it. And for that, I'm particularly grateful. A number of people, not just one or two, but 6, 7, 8 people. And so as I was looking on Facebook, I was getting notices that so-and-so had commented on. And so I kept going back to the original article in order to check the comments. And they were incredible. Horst, who called last Wednesday, here on the program. Horst posted an extensive commentary on the particular issue that I raised. So let me raise it here because I think it's significant. And this was coming, as Thomas Jefferson would say in his famous dialogue between the head and the heart. This came as much, if not more, from the heart than the head. And what I was thinking about, and I think you'll get the sense of it right away, talk about the agony of defeat. I thought the agony was supposed to be a direct result of the defeat, to accompany losing. When the competition's over, so's the pain. When I think back to the very famous commercial approach to ABC Sports, where they talked about the excitement of victory and the agony of defeat. The agony of defeat was associated with the loss. Once the loss was over, the agony dissipated. But this particular election is not quite working out that way. It seems like we're looking at a different version of the old adage. What we're finding is that the agony doesn't really accompany the defeat, but follows it. Pain happens because of it. In effect, what makes my defeat mean so much to so many is that it permits the winners to inflict pain on lots of people. That's agony. Pain that lasts and lasts. And this is just, it seems like I'm playing with words. But the intent is that there's real meaning here. This goes much deeper than the agony of losing an election. It goes to the fact that the people who won the election, unlike what's happened in the past, don't seem to be making the effort to heal the wounds and ease the pain and bring everybody together with the idea that we can find common ground, we can work together on the things that we agree on, and we can put aside for the moment and gradually return to the things that divide us. That's the way that our two-party system has traditionally worked. That's the way that James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and the other architects of the two-party system envisioned that it would work. That's not the way this particular election is shaking out, at least so far. And I guess if you could put a label on today's program so far, at least, you could basically classify it as a hope that the decisions reached so far are not final, and that what we hope will happen indeed could still happen. Because the fact of the matter is, what we're seeing is that, unlike the traditional idea of the agony of defeat, the pain didn't stop when the election was over. On the contrary, that's when the pain began. And the fact of the matter is, the worst fears of people going into the election, that the two sides were so antagonistic toward each other that indeed it was going to be very difficult after the election for the two sides to come together, seems to be playing out. And again, there's only one person at the moment who can change that, and that's the president-elect. So far, he hasn't done it. I hold out hope that before long he'll begin. Welcome to the presidency of Donald Trump, where so many things that aren't right are going on at the same time, it's impossible to take issue with any one or even a few. And then I provided some examples. But let me kind of dwell for a moment on the introductory sentence there. So many things that aren't right are happening at the same time that it's almost impossible to take issue with any one. Before you can get through focusing on one, something else happens. Tradition seems to have been pushed to the back burner. Acceptable behavior during a transition. Acceptable behavior on the part of a victorious candidate toward the losers seems not to be a factor in this transition. There are so many things that are going on. Let me go back and make a point. And again, I don't have anything other than observation on which to validate this point. I just ask that you kind of share with me and give it some thought, which is really all you can do at this point. One of the key features, it seems to me, of the Trump political campaign for president was his control of access to the media. His ability to manipulate the media in such a way that he was able to maintain control of the news day after day, week after week, month after month, through the year plus of primaries, and then finally the final couple of months of the campaign itself. We talked in our last time together, I believe, about the fact that Trump, and everybody knows this, that Donald Trump would get up in the middle of the night and begin to send out Twitter messages on particular issues, whether he was attacking people or making disparaging comments towards groups or many of the other things that opponents of Donald Trump emphasized throughout. And it almost seemed to be one faux pas after the other. And for a long time, the media kept predicting that at some point he was going to make a faux pas that was going to cost him the nomination. It never happened. Trump himself made the comment that if he shot somebody in Manhattan, in Times Square, he wouldn't be convicted. What he was saying is that he is so popular and those people that support him are so avid in their support that they wouldn't even convict him of a crime. That, in effect, he could get away with anything. And, of course, toward the very end of the campaign, that's exactly what that tape that was released, in which he made the disparaging comments about the way he approached or dealt with or interacted with women, that's exactly the same thing. When you're famous, you can do anything and get away with it. That's what he was saying throughout the campaign. But even more important, that seemed to define what he did during the campaign. And that is to make one, what most people traditionally believed would be a faux pas after the other, and never seemed to pay the price for it. He seemed to be able to get away with anything. And the fact of the matter is, as you look back, we can begin to see that there were so many examples. He was doing so many things that caught the media's attention that it was a little bit difficult to focus on one and say, that's the one that's going to cost him the nomination. That's the one that's going to turn off the American electorate. That's the one that's going to basically be the beginning of the end for his candidacy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, he flooded the airwaves with examples of outrageous, unexpected behavior, to the point that the media, the public and public opinion was so overwhelmed with the details of these things that one after the other seemed to pass away. That before people could really whip up anger or horror at one particular situation, something else would happen, and then something else, and something else. Actually, the situation moved so rapidly that at the end you could look back and say he was able to get away with everything because he didn't give anybody the time to focus on anything, on any one thing. Isolated by themselves, particular incidents would have sabotaged the campaign for anyone else in our past election history. But the fact that he did so many different things to so many different groups so frequently meant that he was a moving target. Nothing seemed to stick. Nobody could hit him. The reason I say this, and the reason I take a moment to take you back to the campaign itself, is because this is the same pattern that seems to be defining the transition. One thing after the other is happening that is shocking people. And the fact of the matter is they are happening so often and so quickly, so rapidly, that the media and the general public are in a state of shock, in effect. It's impossible to do anything except to watch it. In horror, in some cases, in disbelief in other cases. And he's doing it. During the transition, he's violating tradition over and over and over again. How do you sit down and write an article or an op-ed piece in a major publication when before it hits the media, something else has happened? Before it hits print, before the argument of somebody who criticizes a particular action, a particular comment or whatever, before they can write up something and get it out there and get it in print, something else has happened. So consequently, things are moving so rapidly that, as in the campaign itself, it's impossible for anybody to make an issue about anything. So while he goes on for an hour interview with Lesley Stahl the Sunday after the election, 5 days after the election, and puts forth a very humble, very sensitive presentation in which he convinces people that the worst fears that people might have of a Trump presidency have been misplaced, and that he's not going to sack the Affordable Care Act in one fell swoop. He's not going to round up and deport 11 million immigrants who are in this country illegally. He's not going to do this. He's not going to do that. And you begin to get the feeling that saner common sense has finally taken over the Trump campaign effort. And that people who are cautioning him about some of these things are finally beginning to get through. There's no question that the final result of that Lesley Stahl election was hope and optimism. After it was over, early in the week last week, Lesley Stahl visited the news media, the morning news programs. Today, Good Morning ABC and CBS Morning News and all the rest of it, CNN, and began to talk about the optimism and almost, in a sense, relieve people's anxieties and concerns. But before people had even the opportunity to process that, information began to come out about some of the appointments and some of the people that he was talking to. And balloons were being released that carried the names of some of the prospective appointments. And of course, the one that continues to get attention is Stephen Bannon, who, there's no question, is a lightning rod. And so far, Mr. Trump has made 3 firm commitments to appointees. And every one of them raises a flag. But before you can make an issue on those, you have to realize that there are additional appointments coming, and that names keep floating around of people who have been invited to Trump Towers in New York or to his golf course in New Jersey or whatever for interviews. The governor of South Carolina, for example. Mitt Romney, for example. And on and on and on. And even the late night comedians are beginning to speculate. Don't be surprised if Hillary Clinton ends up Secretary of State. Don't be surprised if Mitt Romney ends up in the administration. And lo and behold, no sooner was that out than the media began to report that Mitt Romney would hold a session this past Saturday with the president-elect. And so again, one thing after the other seems to be happening so quickly that the media really has no option as to stand back and watch, almost as if they're waiting for the dust to settle. But we know from the year-plus long campaign that Donald Trump never lets the dust settle. As long as the dust hasn't settled, he's in control. Not only is he in control, but he's in control and able to operate without restrictions. In effect, it makes him media-proof, because there's nothing that the media can do fast enough to cause him to put on the brakes. It's brilliant. Now, whether in fact, I kind of, in my mind, I'm saying to myself, if Donald Trump happened to be listening to this, would he call and say you're out of your mind? I don't think so. I have to believe that this kind of behavior is not without intent, is not without meaning. I have to believe it's working too well to not be part of a plan, of a strategy. This weekend, and this gets back to the piece I put on Facebook over the weekend. Two things besides the appointments, and I won't necessarily go into those because I think, within a couple of days we're going to be confronted with some other appointments that'll shock us, because there's no question that among the people who visited with the president-elect yesterday, Rudy Giuliani, Chris Christie, and some folks in the media are saying straight up that these people are not qualified for the positions that are being talked about as being potentially available to them. But again, Donald Trump is interviewing. He's not sharing his conclusions. And the fact of the matter is, one has to wonder whether, in fact, the interviews are not the prelude to a decision but that in fact the decisions have already been made and the interviews are merely for our entertainment. The interviews are merely to keep the media and the general public in suspense. With the appointments of Bannon and Sessions and Flynn, the three appointments he's made so far, it appears that those particular appointments weren't the result of the interview process at all. That in effect, these are appointments that the president-elect had decided to make earlier on. And that all the interviews and all the press and media publicity and all the rest of it about people coming and going into and out of Trump Towers was merely a cover. Every one of those appointments raises questions. Senator Sessions, who will be the Attorney General, for example, and this is common knowledge now, was denied a judgeship in 1986, by a Senate controlled by Republicans because of racist behavior and racist comments that he had made. And now he will be Attorney General. That's one of the firm appointments this man has made. Flynn, as head of intelligence, has made some appointments about Muslims that are extremely inflammatory and dangerous. Ben, chief editor, Breitbart, again, has been associated. The fact of the matter is, much of what's been printed, it has been released or printed in Breitbart, is being attributed to Bannon. Obviously, he didn't write it all, but he's being given credit for it all. That might be a bit unfair. Despite the controversy with all three of those are the three appointments that he's made so far. And then this weekend, he has an appointment with the Prime Minister of Japan, Abe, the first head of state that he's met with as president-elect. When Abe or somebody at his level comes to the country and meets with the president in Washington, it's news. It's big news. There are state dinners associated with it. There usually is a press conference after the meeting with the president in which both the guest and the president address the press and field questions after on what they talked about. In other words, when a president or a president-elect meets a world head of state, it has such implications for the future of the nation and the world that it's news. The media is in on it. There are press conferences after it. It is covered. It's on the media. People know what the topics of discussion were. And all of that serves to give the general public a sense that world affairs are on the front burner and are being handled. In this particular situation, none of that happened. The meeting was in private, sort of. The only people that were in the room, other than the president-elect and Mr. Abe, according to the reports, were Ivanka Trump and her husband, Jared Kushner. And that raises serious questions. There was no media, no agenda, no public information about the issues under discussion. Yet at the same time, Prime Minister Abe is representing one of the 3 or 4 nations with which the United States does most of its commercial business. Japan is one of the nation's major trading partners. What happens to the economy can be affected materially by decisions made between Abe and the president-elect. But we have no idea what they talked about. That contradicts or runs against precedent. The fact that Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner were in the room clearly violates tradition. It violates conflict of interest potential. Conflict of interest is just not an accomplished act of self-interest. The idea of conflict of interest is usually associated with the illusion that something might be going on. There's no evidence that any kind of business deals were cut in that room. But they could have been. Ivanka Trump and her husband are business people. They are business tycoons. They are always in search of the deal. For them to be given priority status in a private meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan, given the degree and amount and range of business that the 2 nations do with each other, violates every tradition in the world. It smacks of the image, the impression of conflict of interest. It seems to give them advantages that no other businesses in the country have access to. It sends the message that if you are in the business world, in the world of commerce, of global commerce, you better be on the inside of the Trump administration, because if you don't get invited to some of these opportunities to cut deals, then you're going to be cut out of the action by those people who are. It blows up any sense of the concept of fairness. It seems to just fly in the face of the way business has always been done. And then, of course, there is the question about whether, in fact, Jared Kushner, as the president-elect's son-in-law, would be violating public policy and public decorum by being on the inside in this administration. At first, the question was whether, in fact, he could accept a formal appointment, whether that would be nepotism, whether that would violate tradition and principle. Now the discussion seems to be focused more on his role as an unofficial inside advisor to Donald Trump. He wouldn't hold an official White House appointment, but on the other hand, he'd be there in a position to influence the decisions that were being made. So that's been an issue of debate throughout. But this meeting with Abe raised all sorts of red flags. But lo and behold, it wasn't the last one this weekend, because the president-elect arranged tours of his new international hotel, which is located in Washington, D.C., almost within spitting distance of the White House. If you remember, just prior to the election, I think it was 9 days or so before the election, Trump took a day away from campaigning in order to go to Washington and cut the ribbon for the formal opening of that hotel, which has actually been in business for a while. This weekend, he arranged for a number of foreign dignitaries to have tours of that hotel, including the penthouse at the top, which the media reports rents for $20,000 a night. And when this was over, 3 dignitaries from India made it very clear that they intended to book stays in that hotel. They intended to stay there because they wanted to make sure that they ingratiated themselves with Mr. Trump, because they believed that that would suit them well in doing official business with the government of the United States after Trump is sworn in as president. In other words, this weekend, Donald Trump was conducting business, promoting his hotel. At the same time, he was involved in the transition to his own administration. That also raises all sorts of flags, all sorts of no-nos, because it makes very clear a couple of things. It makes clear that Donald Trump, as president, does not intend to cease to be Donald Trump deal maker. That he always has been a businessman and will continue to be a businessman. That he'll always be on the lookout for deals, for opportunities. That it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to separate Donald Trump the president from Donald Trump the tycoon. Traditionally, that's always been an issue which has concerned incoming administrations. Numerous former presidents have put their private affairs and properties and investments into blind trusts so that they would be handled by somebody else and that they wouldn't know what, in effect, their best business interests were. Because given their role as president, they would be in a position to cut deals to benefit themselves if they knew what benefiting themselves required. Donald Trump clearly will always know. He will be always making deals. He will be receiving foreign visitors and putting them up in a hotel which he owns, as he did in the campaign, where he scheduled campaign events and speeches and rallies in his own facilities, and then billed the public trough for money for the use of his facilities for public purposes at rates which are much higher than the going rate. He stands to be able to do that as president of the United States. What bothers me is he hasn't done it yet because he's not president yet. But his behavior this weekend suggests to a lot of people that he doesn't see anything wrong with it. My sense is that he may see things wrong with it, but he's committed to doing it anyway because he believes he can get away with it, because he's been able to get away with everything else. As an optimist who has been arguing for the last several days that we really need to give this man a chance, that there may be a difference between getting elected president and being president, and that we had to basically give him a chance to prove what kind of a president he'd be. I'm not being reassured. I'm concerned. I'm more concerned rather than less concerned as we move further and further away from the election. I'm finding it more and more difficult to be optimistic in the face of those who are convinced that Donald Trump will never serve his 4 years because he's going to commit so many violations in so many different areas that it's almost a given that he'll be impeached, even by a Congress that he controls. I doubt that. I really believe that the Congress, both houses, under the control of Republicans, are effectively under his control because he's the one that gave them the power that they have. They are not going to take issue with him unless they are absolutely forced to. If he was able to get away with things in the past, it's clear to me that he'll be able to get away with even more in the future. Because the alternative branches of government that we depend upon to check executive behavior are under his control. It's not going to be long before the Supreme Court falls under that same heading. And so consequently, as an observer on the outside looking in, and all I'm doing is watching the news and listening to the news and reading as other people are, I'm not getting a warm and fuzzy feeling about what's happening. And to top it all off, when Vice President-elect Pence attended the performance of Hamilton, the musical, Friday evening, and at the conclusion of the musical, one of the actors, the actor that plays Aaron Burr in the musical, took a piece of paper out of his pocket and made a speech to the vice president as he was leaving about what he and other people hoped would happen and about their fears. The president-elect, once he found out about that, accused the cast of Hamilton of bullying the vice president-elect. On Facebook, I made the comment that what was said Friday night to the vice president-elect does not constitute bullying compared to what's happening in the nation's schools, what's happening in the nation at large, what's happening with on our roadways with road rage, what's happening in fire bombings. Compared to that, that's bullying. And as incoming president, Mr. Trump, you really would be well advised to redefine and rethink your approach to bullying. Because clearly, that wasn't it. That is the piece that I put on Facebook yesterday morning. It's gotten quite a bit of attention. It's not that long. I made it obviously seem long here because I've been covering it for the better part of an hour. But the fact of the matter is the posting on Facebook is rather short. It merely makes the case about the link between agony and pain. And then it basically addresses the three issues that we've talked about which is the meeting with Prime Minister Abe of Japan, the three Indian dignitaries given tour of Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C., and the incident on Broadway on Friday night. Not one of those three gives me comfort. All of them concern me. All of them together are what prompted me to put this posting on Facebook. I share it with you today, not in any way to try to convince you of anything. I'm not advocating that people take a position against Donald Trump and against his administration. I'm not advocating that people stand back and make the decision to give him a chance. All I'm saying is, like you, I'm conflicted by which way to go. And I'm looking to the incoming administration for answers and solutions to my confliction. And up to this point, I'm not finding it. That's really the point that I wanted to make in this, our first hour. We've just reached the top of the hour, and I think it's a good time to pause, take our 5-minute break before we get into our second hour. In the second hour, I'd like to address an issue that also is on our Facebook page. This particular posting I posted about 2 hours before we went on the air today. It deals with the Electoral College. It's the topic that we began to address last Wednesday that we never finished when Horst called from Taiwan, and our entire second hour was spent in an exhilarating conversation with Horst. I felt that given the fact that this issue was there and a lot of people are talking about it, there's growing sentiment in this country to abolish the Electoral College, especially after this most recent election. So it seemed most appropriate and timely to take on the issue of the Electoral College, and that's what I'd like to do in our second hour. But first, we're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I encourage you to stay with us. This will be a short break, and I know that Agnes will have some pleasant music for everybody to listen to during the break. In the meantime, if you'd like to go to Facebook, to our Facebook page, you can check out the posting that's there on the two-party system. It's only about 2 hours old, and we'll get into that when we come back. Just hang on. We won't be long. Thank you. Thank you, Agnes. Welcome to our second hour on this Monday. Today is the 21st day of November in the year 2016. It is a pleasure to be with you today. It looks like it's appearing to be a full week here at the Virtual Center. I know that it is Thanksgiving week. I anticipate, I'll check with the folks at Head On and make sure, but I do anticipate that we'll be doing our regular 3 programs this week, even though I know a number of people do take Wednesdays off, because Wednesday for many folks is cooking day and preparation day and shopping day for Thanksgiving. But I really don't see a reason why we wouldn't be doing our programs. But on the other hand, it could be that we might be having some issues at the network end here, and therefore it would be difficult to find people to produce the program. So, but I'll find that out and share that with you tomorrow.
I'll be here, Bill.
Pardon?
I'll be here.
You'll be there.
I'll be here.
Somebody else is cooking dinner at your house, huh?
I can do it all.
You can do it. Oh my God. Unfortunately, there's an awful lot of women that feel the same way, that they're asked to do it all. Thank you, Agnes. So again, barring some emergency that I don't know about, I do anticipate that we'll be together all 3 days this week. So anyway, it is a pleasure. If you are just joining us, if you missed our first hour, then we spent most of the time talking about some of the incidents that have occurred in recent days that are associated with the Trump transition program. And I think you probably know what they are. And I just express concerns that I'm hearing for a number of different directions and a number of distinct sources. And again, I think the other thing to keep in mind about this all, and I didn't mention this in our first hour, but I know that many people, especially people who listen to the Virtual Center and who are regular listeners to the Head On Radio Network, know that all of this can be attributed in part, I'm sure, to a 24/7 media. In other words, that if you think about it, it's hard to imagine a situation in the past where the appointments of an incoming administration received the kind of attention that this appointment process is having and is receiving. On the other hand, we're dealing with a president-elect who glows in this kind of limelight. And so, in a sense, this is a marriage made in heaven between a media that needs news and a president-elect that basically makes it his life work to provide nothing else but news. So we may be looking at the perfect storm here, so to speak. There's no question that part of the attention on the appointment process is driven by that as well. In other words, that's a totally separate issue to the qualifications of the particular appointees in question, or candidates for appointment in question, and all the rest of it. But again, this is the environment within which this whole thing is happening, and I think all of us are fully aware of that. That's always there, and I think we need to realize it, because we know, and we said oftentimes over and over again, that when you have a 24/7 news cycle like we have in this nation today, and with the growth of social media and all the rest of it, then the media clearly moves from the broadcasting, the presentation of news, to the making of news. A key part of the story is the media. It always is, and apparently always will be. So I think we'll have to be aware of that as well. I do encourage you to share your thoughts and your concerns and ideas with us here at the Virtual Center. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd be more comfortable sharing your thoughts in an email, then I encourage you to drop an email to me, and I'll do the very best I can to get your thoughts on the air. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And then finally, I do encourage you to check out our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook, to the search box, type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. And most specifically, the lead item on our Facebook page today, if you check it out, is the piece that we're going to be spending this second hour in today's program on, which is the sentiment about abolishing the Electoral College. We began to address this issue last week here at the Virtual Center, and part of the reason for it, of course, is that there is strong sentiment in the nation, especially among Democrats and supporters of Hillary Clinton, to do something about the Electoral College. There has been sentiment in recent years, for a long time, about abolishing the Electoral College. I can remember when I was teaching community college in Richmond, Virginia, in the early 80s, that I hosted or assigned a group of students to conduct a debate on the pros and cons of the Electoral College. Even then, there was strong sentiment against preserving the tradition of the Electoral College. Many students believed, that by definition it was undemocratic that it denied the people the right to directly choose the President of the United States. And I can remember two teams of students putting together very persuasive arguments on both sides of that question and presenting in debate format those particular positions. And that was more than 30 years ago, closer to 40 years ago. So the sentiment about the Electoral College has been around for a long time. It seems to violate the principles of democracy and popular government that all of us are so committed to. We know that the founders were committed to those principles as well. So in a sense, it's not really that difficult to envision an argument in which you could say that the Electoral College, even though it was approved, designed by and approved by the founders at the Constitutional Convention, the fact of the matter is, in this day and age, were the founders to be consulted, they would probably say that the Electoral College has outlived its usefulness and that it's time for change. It's time for it to go. That sentiment has been there for a long time. One of the arguments in favor of doing something about the Electoral College has been the possibility, the likelihood, that we would encounter a situation where the candidate who received the most popular votes would not receive the most electoral votes. And throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, people were speculating that we were going to come across a situation where the person elected president because they got the most electoral votes didn't win the popular vote. And that would create a problem, many people felt, a perception problem. It would minimize or cut in on the power of the president because those opposed to the president would always be able to say, well, he's claiming a mandate. He's claiming that he was elected by the people. But the fact of the matter is the majority of the people voted for somebody else. And that would weaken the influence and the power of new presidents, the concern was. Well, lo and behold, that happened in the election of 2000, the election between Al Gore and George Bush. And we know how that one turned out through the intervention of the Supreme Court. But the fact of the matter is, George Bush was awarded Florida by the Supreme Court and consequently was appointed president while the fact remains that Al Gore received 740,000 more popular votes than did George Bush. In other words, people's worst fears came to fruition in 2000. Al Gore got 750,000 more popular votes than did the president-elect. But lo and behold, that's exactly what's happened this year in the election that was just held 2 weeks ago tomorrow. The difference is the number of popular votes that Hillary Clinton received over and above the number Donald Trump received is probably going to reach 2 million. At last count, towards the end of last week, the reports were that as the count continues in many Western states, Hillary Clinton was ahead in popular votes by more than 1.2 million. And with more counting to be done in states like California and Oregon and Washington, the thinking was that her plurality could approach 2 million votes before the counting is ended. So it stands to reason that a sentiment based on what could happen for so many years now has a fire under it, because in fact it did happen. It has happened twice in this new century already, and we're only in 2016. We're only 16 years in. We've only had 4 elections since the millennium, and already in 2 of them, we're confronting the realities of different candidates winning the electoral vote and the popular vote. So many people believe that it's time for a change. And it stands to reason that those most in favor of a change right now are those who supported Hillary Clinton, those who voted Democrat. The fact of the matter is, it's a problem for many people to deal with the fact that Donald Trump is claiming a mandate because he won the Electoral College by a substantial margin. He got 290 electoral votes when only 270 is required. So he won the electoral vote by 20 electoral votes. But the fact of the matter is he lost the election, the popular vote, by 2 million, potentially. And there's a concern that this raises or requires an asterisk after his name when we think about future students who'll be looking at the list of elected presidents. Because, in fact, what we have is a situation where the elected president is not the president that was able to garner the majority of the popular vote. So the concern is we got to do something about the Electoral College. Politically, that's going to be difficult. Because right now, Republicans don't have any inclination at all to tamper with a system that they have spent years getting control of. When you think of the money and the resources that has gone in to Republican efforts to take control of so many of our states, legislatures, and governorships, so that Democrats now control only about 25% of our state legislatures and or governorships. The Republicans have pretty well taken control of state governments throughout the nation. I think the number is in the mid to upper 30s out of the 50 states. They control the states. They control the state legislatures. They control the governorships. They're the ones that are benefiting from the Electoral College right now. They don't really have any incentive at all to consider change. So the Electoral College, whether to abolish it or whether to retain it, in theory, could be an issue that would engage both sides in substantive progressive debate. In other words, a debate on this issue under normal circumstances could be a good thing. It could be a consensus builder. But in the political environment we're in, it seems just the opposite is true. It seems that the Electoral College right now is not an issue that's going to bring the sides together. Rather, it's an issue that's going to continue to separate and to divide rather than to build unity throughout the nation. I felt that the time was ripe to really try to put something together, something substantive together on the Electoral College. And while what I've done constitutes history, constitutes research-based history, the fact of the matter is there's a political side to it as well. Because in my research, I've concluded that this is not the time to think about replacing the Electoral College with a direct election of the President of the United States. And the reason I say that is because of the Donald Trump interview with Lesley Stahl held a week ago last Sunday evening, November 13th. This I think I've shared in our most recent programs here at the Virtual Center. This is an issue that I have heard no one talk about. But during that interview, Donald Trump made the statement to Lesley Stahl that social media got him elected. If that's not a quote, it's pretty close. Because Lesley Stahl had raised the issue about Twitter and about Donald Trump's use of Twitter throughout the campaign. And what she was asking was, did the president-elect, did Donald Trump intend to continue to go to Twitter even after he sworn in as president of the United States? And Trump's response to that question was, A, that social media got him elected, and B, that social media, Twitter, gives him access, immediate access, to tens of millions of voters, of supporters. It allows Donald Trump to go directly to the people over and over and over again on issues. Not only is he likely to not receive a lot of pushback from a Republican-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate, and potentially a Republican-controlled Supreme Court, but he's also going to be in instantaneous communication with tens of millions of citizens on a regular basis. That kind of combination is going to mean that there will be virtually no checks, no balances, no filters, no mechanism to slow down decision-making in this republic under Donald Trump. In effect, then, what this potentially does is alter the entire makeup of this republic. It renders inert the checks and balances system and the separation of powers implemented by the founders as checks on demagoguery and the passions of an uninformed public being manipulated for political purposes. It gives the administration direct access to public opinion. It effectively cuts the media out of the equation. Not totally, but potentially. It effectively makes it possible for decisions to be made and implemented and approved by the general public almost immediately. The Electoral College is hardly the only or the most important check in Madison's political fabric in the Constitution of designed in the Constitution of the United States. Madison's check on factions. His idea in 51, Federalist 51, of pitting ambition against ambition in order to implement or to build into the system a checks and balances system, in order to initiate the forced debate, forced compromise, forced negotiation. All of that is on hold. This is not the time, I believe, that we want to think about abolishing the Electoral College. It's clearly not the most effective or the most important check on a runaway government, but it's one of the few checks left that we still have. When I raise this question, it seems to me the immediate response could be, under the circumstances, what's to prevent government, the national government, from implementing its will by going through the states? Theoretically, the states are going to be a major check on a runaway federal government, the founders argued. The Electoral College, by establishing a filter or a mechanism through which the public voice, the popular voice, would go before the President of the United States is selected, has become, under the two-party system, almost automatic. But the fact of the matter is, it's still a check. It's still a procedure. It's still the law. And it seems to me the last thing we want to do right now is remove all the checks when the potential for runaway government is already knocking on the door. This is not the time to make it easier for that to happen. It seems to me our time would be better spent finding ways to institute new checks, new filters, new controls, than it would be in going through the complicated procedure of abolishing the Electoral College or securing the kind of consensus among states necessary to abolish it. There have been reports from a number of places throughout the country reminding folks that there is no law or no requirement that says that the electors must follow the will of the voters in their states. It's become tradition that they do. Two-party politics suggest that it's what they must do. But the fact of the matter is there's no law that says it in fact is what they have to do. Electors still maintain their independence. They are appointed in order to implement the will of the voters, the majority of the voters in their states. If the majority of the voters in their state voted for X candidate, then the electors for that political party are the electors that get to cast the vote for president from that state. Their job, most people can assume, is to cast their ballots for the winning candidate because that's what the people decided when they voted. But there's nothing to require that. Many Hillary supporters are urging elected electors, state electors, to vote their conscience and maybe cast their ballots for Hillary, even though Trump won their states. There's no law preventing that. Chances are it's not going to be successful. But a lot of people are encouraging it anyway. So it seemed to me that the best thing that we could do right now is go back to the very beginning and try to examine exactly what the founders thought they were doing when they inserted the Electoral College concept into the constitutional system. In the debate that I mentioned that I hosted in the early 80s in Virginia, the principal argument against abolishing the Electoral College was that it was a creation of the founders. It was indeed a figment or function of the intent of the founders, and that we would be walking in uncharted territory if we begin to change or to eliminate key elements of the Constitution that the founders put in there when we really weren't sure what the outcome would be. In other words, the principal defense of the Electoral College has traditionally been that the founders created it. It's tradition. It's always been there. It's worked. People have gotten used to it and have learned to accept it. And that what we would be doing would be creating discontent and disorder if we abolished the Electoral College. But most important, we would be violating the intent of the founders. That statement, we would be violating the intent of the founders, is based on the assumption, of course, that there is an intent. But in going back and looking at the sources, in reading the debates in the Constitutional Convention related to the Electoral College, what we find is that there really isn't an intent. The founders didn't come together and agree on one particular outcome that they expected the Electoral College to produce. There really wasn't an intent. Instead, what there was a whole series of concerns, worries, fears about the selection of the President of the United States. Some believed that the President would become a king. Some wanted the President to become a king. Hamilton was one of those. Hamilton said in his very famous speech on the 18th of June, his 6-hour speech at the Constitutional Convention, that what the delegates ought to be doing in Philadelphia is constructing a constitutional system that came as close to a monarchy as they believed they could get by the people, or get the people to support. The people would never support a monarchy. They would never support a president with a lifelong appointment like the King of England. Hamilton supported lifetime appointments for not only the president, but for members of Congress. But he recognized that there's no way in the world that the American people would support that. So Hamilton's argument is that what the delegates had to do is to come up with the next best thing. Something that came as close to monarchy as possible without actually being monarchy, because the American people would never support that. Hamilton was eventually forced to defend the Constitution that came out, even though he believed that it wouldn't work. He believed that it probably couldn't work because the new central government wasn't strong enough for him. But he also realized that after several months of debate and compromise, it was the best document, the best constitution that they were going to get, so that the best thing he could do was support it. It wasn't his favorite, but it was the best thing he had. So he's the one that came up with the idea of the Federalist Papers in order to sell the idea in the state of New York. And he went to his friend James Madison for support. The fact of the matter is, Hamilton wrote most of the Federalist Papers. Madison wrote about 15 of them. John Jay wrote only 5 or 6 of them. So, in a sense, there was a strong sentiment among some at the convention that the president ought to be a king, but also a realization that that couldn't happen. So the next best solution was a president that was as close to all-powerful as possible under the circumstances. And many delegates believed that the best way to get that was to have the Congress, the national legislature, pick the president. Most people believed that the average people, the common people, the masses, were not qualified or capable to choose wisely for the executive, for the presidency. Many people, and I think I'm one, for a long time argued that there's all sorts of evidence in the debates that the delegates didn't believe that the people were competent enough to make this kind of a decision. George Mason, and when I raised this before, I was uncertain of the author. It is George Mason of Virginia. On the 17th of July, Mason made his argument that asking the people to choose a president is like asking a blind man to select pretty colors. While there's clearly an indication there that the competence of the people to make such a monumental decision is distrusted, the fact of the matter is there's also the realization that the people didn't have the perspective, didn't have the opportunity or access to the kinds of information necessary to make the right decision. And one could defend Mason, and I think should defend Mason, by saying that just as James Madison didn't believe that the people could not self-govern, but that they could be educated into knowing the criteria to look for in electing representatives, so also Mason and the others believed that it's possible that the people could be educated to choose a president wisely. But the fact of the matter is, at that point, they couldn't. And therefore, you couldn't trust them with that responsibility. So many people believed that the national legislature, the Congress, was the best place to go for the selection of the president. But that raised all sorts of issues. That violated separation of powers. Madison, who designed the Virginia plan, and many of his supporters at the convention were opposed to the national legislature making the decision, because that would make the president dependent on Congress. And that would violate the very principles on which the national government was based. But for most of the summer of 1787, most people accepted the fact that while that wasn't the ideal, it was probably the way we would end up going. And so from the early in June all the way up until late in July of 1787, there was an unspoken assumption in the convention that the president would be selected by Congress. Madison became especially upset by that prospect. It would violate separation of powers. It would make checks and balances impossible. It just was contradictory to everything that this republic was going to be about. And then again, there were some people who believed that the states ought to be as powerful as possible, that what made this government unique was the nature of federalism, was the fact that it was a federal republic, that the central government had some powers, but the states were key elements in this structure. And they believed that as much as possible, the power of the states ought to be recognized. So their solution was, let's have the state legislatures choose the president. Madison, Hamilton, and others went nuts over that, because obviously the whole purpose of the Constitution was to reduce the powers of the states and to make the states preeminent in the selection of the president violated everything the Constitution was about to them. So Madison concluded, Hamilton finally came around to agreeing with a position argued from the very beginning by James Wilson, a delegate from Pennsylvania, an attorney. No sooner did the convention open in June, it opened at the very end of May, and began to do business the last couple of days of May. On the 2nd of June, James Wilson made a proposal for choosing the president. He felt that allowing the people to select the president was the only way to go. It was the best way to go. That there was too much danger with all the other options. But he also realized that there were too many people in the Congress who didn't believe that the people were capable or qualified to make this kind of appointment or make this kind of decision. So Wilson came up with an alternative. That alternative was the Electoral College. His proposal to divide the states into districts and to have the people in each district choose an elector. And at the appropriate time, all the electors from the districts within that state would come together and choose the candidate that that state wanted for president. And then that vote would be pooled with the same process going on in other states. And that these electors together would make the best decision on the selection of a president. That Madison could accept as an alternative to a direct vote. He believed that the people were the only source, the only resource that could be trusted to choose the president. The Electoral College was a viable alternative that had some chance of being successful. But there was one additional factor that won Madison over totally to the Electoral College. And that was a political consideration, raw and pure. The reason that Madison believed that popular election, the direct election of the president by the people, would not work, was because that would allow the northern states, the largest states, to dominate the process. The northern states had large numbers of qualified voters, whereas the South didn't. All the states had property qualifications for voting. Most of the northern states, operating on a principle of free enterprise, made it possible for most property owners to qualify to vote. But in the South, the property, most of the best property, was owned by a few people, by plantation owners. And the fact of the matter is, the millions of slaves that were in the southern states could not qualify to vote for President of the United States. They weren't going to be given the vote. Consequently, the northern states, the larger states, would dominate the process, and the South would never have a chance to choose a president. But here's the kicker. Because of the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, slaves counted as 3/5 of the population of a person for purposes of calculating population. And it was the population of the state that determined the number of congressional representatives. So slaves counted in the selection of representatives, but they didn't count as voters in the direct election of a president. But under the electoral system, the dividing the states into districts, slaves would count in documenting the population, which would determine the number of electors. So in other words, 3/5 of the slave population in each state would contribute to the overall number of electors. If the vote was direct, they were not going to be able to vote. So Madison realized that the Electoral College was not only an acceptable alternative to direct election of the president, the Electoral College was actively, clearly, the best way to choose the president, because it gave the South the opportunity to take advantage of slaves to increase the number of electors. Consequently, the Electoral College became the way to go for him and for those who supported him. So the fact of the matter is, the Electoral College, confusing as it is, was not created to reflect the intent of the founders, because there really wasn't an intent of the founders. What they were a number of proposals, all of which came with problems. The Electoral College seemed to resolve most of the problems. Therefore, the Electoral College became the optimum way to choose the President of the United States. What that means is those people who are opposed to abolishing the Electoral College because it would violate the intent of the founders really are on shaky ground. Because the fact of the matter is there wasn't an intent of the founders. On the other hand, given the realities, the 21st century realities of social media, it seems to me that the Electoral College looms as one of the few remaining checks on what Madison and his supporters saw as the danger of a runaway federal government. In effect, then, the fact that the Electoral College requires the choice of the president to come through the states and to be the vote to be cast by electors in each state stands as one of the few remaining checks on a president who has instantaneous access to tens of millions of people through social media. I would suggest this is not the time to abolish the Electoral College. But I would even suggest more than that. I would argue that this is the time to take very seriously the realities of social media and the potential that it has, not positive potential, but negative potential, to really obliterate the checks and balances system built into our Constitution by the founders. What we need are proposals to find ways to replace the existing checks with workable ones, because technology has rendered the existing checks inoperable, I believe. This is obviously a very opinionated point of view on the Electoral College. But the history is there. If you go to the Facebook page, I've put a piece, this is kind of a draft of an article that I hope to work into publication form over the next several days and submit. But I ask for your input now. I encourage you to go to the Facebook page. We'll be back tomorrow at our regular Tuesday time, which will be 30 minutes later than our regular start time. We'll be beginning at 1:30 p.m. tomorrow Eastern Time. I urge you between now and then to go to our Facebook page, look at the piece that I have posted there, consider some of the arguments, and most important, think of ways that we could use the current structure, and in this case, the Electoral College as it currently exists, and make changes in it that would make it operative under present circumstances. Because the present circumstances are not circumstances that the founders ever envisioned. Madison believed in Federalist Number 10 that the enlarged sphere, the size of the nation, made it impossible for the majority faction to become operable. Social media has changed that. Social media has given us access to millions of people on an instantaneous basis. As I mentioned at the end of the piece that's posted on Facebook, through cell phones and social media and instantaneous communication, revolutions, the topplings of governments are happening throughout the Middle East, around the world. So the idea of checks and balances and separation of powers, which in Madison's time seemed to work, in today's world of social media, can't work any longer. It seems to me that in order to preserve the republic, we've got to find alternatives. And I can't think of a better place to start than right here with those people who are part of the Virtual Center family. So again, I encourage you to take a look at this and think about calling the program tomorrow, Wednesday, whatever, and sharing your thoughts and your potentials and your suggestions with us. Give us all a chance to digest your thinking and to find, I think this is really important. I think in the long term, we're going to find it critical. Because let's face it, once the Trump administration goes into office, one of the first things that's going to happen is attention to the Supreme Court. And I would suggest that not too long after that is going to come a move to convene a constitutional convention under Article 5. Because Republicans have now achieved the kind of state success which makes the possibility of such a convention a reality. It's time to put the system, the republic, on the table and find ways to save it. I think we've reached that point. We've also reached the top of the hour. So I'm going to quickly say thank you, invite you back tomorrow, encourage you to be kind to each other, and thank you for listening. Good day. Have a great day.